In the spring of 1981, on the wall of the county extension office in Buchanan County, Iowa, there hung a soil map that every farmer in the county had memorized without trying. The good ground was shaded dark, rich black prairie loam that grew 150 bushel corn without asking for much in return. The average ground came in gray. And then up in the northwest corner near the river bluffs, there was a patch shaded so close to white it barely showed up at all. 40 acres, Class 6 soil, rocky, thin, steep in places, the kind of ground where a plow blade hit limestone before it hit 6 inches deep. The county extension agent, a man named Dale Mezer, had a name for it. He called it dead ground. Nobody argued with him. Nobody had argued with him for 30 years because nobody had ever seen any reason to. Those 40 acres had been passed over, traded away, and abandoned more times than anyone could count. The last tenant who tried to farm it, a man named Sweeney, quit after 2 seasons and told the landlord he'd rather dig ditches for a living than fight those rocks one more day. The ground sat empty after that. Weeds took it. Cedar trees crept in from the fence rows. The county stopped listing it as cropland on the assessor's records. For all practical purposes, those 40 acres had been erased from the agricultural map of Buchanan County, Iowa. And then in March of 1981, a man named Walter Gunderson bought them. 40 acres of the worst ground in Buchanan County. He paid $185 an acre when the good ground next door was selling for $3,200. The John Deere dealer in Jessup, a man named Phil Kramer, heard about it that same afternoon at the feed store. Phil was the kind of man who wore a gold watch to the feed store and always stood close enough to the counter that you couldn't miss it. He sold more equipment than anyone in the county, and he had a particular talent for knowing which way the wind was blowing and making sure everyone knew he knew. When he heard that Walt Gunderson had bought the dead ground 40, he laughed so hard he spilled his coffee on the counter. Walt Gunderson just bought dead ground, Phil said, still laughing, mopping at the counter with a paper towel. That's like buying a coffin and calling it a house. The men in the store laughed. The feed rep from DeKalb laughed. Even the kid behind the counter smiled. The joke spread to the diner, to the co-op, to the elevator. For a while, Walter Gunderson and his 40 acres of dead ground was the standard punchline in Buchanan County. Then it stopped being funny. Now let me tell you about Walter Gunderson. Because this story makes no sense unless you understand who he was and where he came from, and why he saw something in 40 acres of rock and failure that everybody else had been walking past for 30 years. Walt was 44 years old in 1981. He'd grown up on his father's 200-acre farm outside Jessup. His father, Hank Gunderson, had farmed that ground with a Farmall M and a 2-bottom plow for 30 years, and had never once borrowed money he didn't have to borrow. When the original mortgage was paid off in 1950, Hank celebrated by burning the payment book in the kitchen stove. When the neighbors started buying new John Deeres in the 70s on credit that felt like free money, Hank kept his Farmall M running with baling wire and stubbornness. When the bankers drove out to offer operating loans at favorable rates, Hank told them the same thing every time. "I don't owe any man anything, and I intend to die that way." He died in the fall of 1978, debt-free, leaving Walt the 200 acres, a shop full of hand tools, and a Farmall M with 11,000 hours on the meter. Walt farmed those 200 acres the same way his father had, corn and oats in rotation, a few head of cattle, hay in the bottoms. He kept the Farmall running. He drove a 1971 Ford pickup with 140,000 miles on it and wore the same Carhartt jacket for 9 years. While his neighbors were leveraging everything they owned to buy more land and bigger equipment during the boom years of the 70s, betting on grain prices that felt like they could only go one direction, Walt put $600 a month into a savings account at the Jessup State Bank. By March of 1981, he had $47,000 in that account. That's when the Brand estate went to auction. Old Elmer Brand had died without heirs, and his executor was selling everything off piece by piece. The good ground, 280 acres of Class 1 and 2 soil, went fast. Multiple bidders. Final price, $3,200 an acre. Nobody wanted the dead ground 40. The auctioneer asked 3 times before Walt raised his hand. $185 an acre, $7,400 total, cash, no bank involved. Phil Kramer found out that same afternoon. He was at the feed store when Walt came in for a bag of clover seed, leaning on the counter with his gold watch catching the fluorescent light, in the middle of telling a story about a farmer who'd just taken delivery on a new 4640. "Hey, Gunderson," Phil stopped mid-sentence, "heard you bought the Brant 40. Walt nodded. "The dead ground 40. Walt nodded again. Phil looked around at the other men in the store, 3 farmers, the DeKalb rep, the kid at the register, and grinned. "Walt, I've sold equipment to every farmer in this county for 15 years, and I've seen some questionable decisions. But buying dead ground is like putting new tires on a car with no engine. That ground's been abandoned twice and failed 3 times. You bought the one thing in Buchanan County that nobody else would touch." Walt didn't say anything. He paid for his clover seed. He walked out to the Ford, put the seed in the bed, started the engine, and drove home on gravel roads while the sun went down behind the grain elevators. He didn't look angry. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked like a man who had already thought about what everyone was going to say and had decided it didn't change anything. Let me tell you what Walt actually did with those 40 acres. Because what he did is the whole point. He didn't plow, he didn't disc, he didn't plant corn or soybeans or anything the market would pay for. In April of 1981, he walked every inch of those 40 acres with a notebook and a soil probe his father had made in the workshop, a T-handled steel tube for pulling soil cores. He took 47 samples from across the property. He noted where the limestone was close to the surface, where the clay was deepest, where water pooled after rain, which slopes faced south, which faced north. He mapped the whole property by hand on graph paper, sitting at the kitchen table every night for a week, building a picture of what those 40 acres actually were before deciding what to do with them. What he found wasn't what the soil map said. The map showed dead ground. What Walt found was tired ground. Ground that had been treated wrong for 100 years, plowed when it shouldn't have been plowed, planted to corn when it should have been rested, pushed with heavy equipment across slopes that couldn't handle the weight. Every year the rain had washed what little topsoil existed down into the creek at the south edge. By 1981, the flat spots had maybe 3 inches of topsoil and the slopes had almost none. The organic matter was at 1.2%. Good Iowa prairie soil runs between 5 and 6. The biology in the soil, the earthworms, the fungi, the bacteria that make soil actually function, was essentially gone. Dead ground hadn't been born dead. It had been killed, slowly over a century, by people who didn't understand what they were doing to it. Walt understood something different, and in April of 1981 he started doing something about it. He planted clover. Not corn, not soybeans. Red clover, 15 pounds per acre, broadcast by hand from a canvas bag he slung over his shoulder, walking those rocky limestone slopes in his work boots while his neighbors drove air-conditioned cabs over flat black ground. He seeded the flatter areas with red clover and Timothy grass. The steeper slopes got sweet clover and brome. The lowest wet ground near the creek got reed canary grass to hold the banks together. Phil Kramer drove past one afternoon in his dealership truck and saw Walt broadcasting seed by hand on the hillside. He slowed down, looked, shook his head, and drove on. At the cafe in town that evening, he told anyone who would listen that Gunderson was out there seeding dead ground with clover like it was 1910. "That ground won't grow clover any better than it grew corn," Phil said. He was wrong, and here's why. Clover is a legume. Legumes do something corn and soybeans can't. Their roots form a relationship with soil bacteria that pulls nitrogen gas directly from the atmosphere and converts it into a form plants can use. A good stand of red clover fixes 80 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year, the equivalent of $40 to $75 worth of anhydrous ammonia, for nothing. But the nitrogen was almost secondary. The clover roots went deep, deeper than corn roots, deeper than any crop anyone had planted on those slopes. They broke through the hardpan clay and created channels, pathways for water and air to penetrate ground that had been compacted for a century. When the clover died back in winter, those channels stayed open and the decaying roots became food for whatever biology was still alive in the soil. Earthworms came. Fungi came. The microscopic networks that make soil actually function started rebuilding themselves in ground that had been biologically dead for decades. Walt didn't harvest the clover the first year. He let it grow, let it bloom, let the bees work it through the summer, and then in October he mowed it and let it lay on the ground. The biomass went back into the soil, cover, mulch, food for the microbes. The second year, 1982, same process, but he added something. He made a deal with a dairy farmer named Arch Schultz 3 miles down the road who had more manure than he knew what to do with. Walt hauled it himself, 15 loads with a borrowed spreader and the Farmall M8 tons per acre on the flat ground, less on the slopes. The nutrients fed the clover. The clover fed the soil. The soil began to change. By the fall of 1982, the organic matter in the flat areas had risen from 1.2% to 1.6%. That doesn't sound like much, but in soil science, a 0.4% increase in organic matter in a single year on ground that had been declining for a century is significant. It meant the biology was working. Something was happening. The county extension agent, Dale Mezer, the same man who had named it dead ground and never seen a reason to change his mind, heard what Walt was doing and drove out to have a look. He walked the 40 acres with Walt, took his own samples and didn't say much. But when he got back to his office, he pulled Walt's file and wrote a note in the margin, Gunderson doing something unusual, worth watching. In 1983, year 3, Walt added cattle. He fenced the steeper slopes and brought in 8 head to graze the grass, light stocking, moved every few days so they never overgrazed any one spot. The cattle ate the grass. They deposited manure. Their hooves pressed seeds into the soil and broke the surface crust, creating small pockets where new plants could establish. At light stocking rates, the trampling that would have been destructive was instead beneficial. It was deliberate, controlled. Exactly the opposite of how that ground had always been treated. Meanwhile, the rest of Buchanan County was coming apart. The farm crisis that had been building since 1979 hit full force in 1982 and 1983. Farmers who had borrowed at 9% were renewing at 18%. Corn had dropped to $2.40 a bushel. Land values were falling $200 an acre per year. The Farmers' Home Administration was sending acceleration notices, demanding full repayment of loans that farmers had believed they had decades to satisfy. The options were stark: liquidate voluntarily or be shut down. Phil Kramer's dealership, which had sold 32 new John Deeres in 1979, sold 7 in 1982. 3 of those were repossessions from his own customers that he'd had to take back and try to sell again. The showroom that had been full of shiny green iron was half empty. Phil started selling used equipment, including farmalls, which he would have laughed at the idea of handling 5 years earlier. Walt watched all of it from dead ground. He didn't say anything. He just kept planting clover. In the fall of 1983, Walt drove to a meeting at the Iowa State Extension Office in Independence to hear a soil scientist from Iowa State University named Dr. Richard Coig. Coig was talking about something most farmers in the room had never heard of: no-till farming. The idea was to stop plowing entirely, plant seeds directly into the residue of the previous crop, and let the soil biology do the work that tillage was supposed to do. The concept had been around since 1943, when a man named Edward Faulkner wrote a book called Plowman's Folly, arguing that nobody had ever given a scientific reason for plowing. But in 1943, the equipment to make no-till work at scale didn't exist. By 1983, it did. After the meeting, Walt waited until the room emptied and walked up to Dr. Coig. He showed him the soil samples from dead ground, 3 years of data, the organic matter trend, the pH changes, the earthworm counts. Coig looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he looked at Walt. "How many acres?" 40. "What did you pay?" 185 an acre. Coig was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Gunderson," he said, "everyone in this county bought the best ground they could afford and then mined it until it was average. You bought the worst ground in the county, and you're building it into something better. In 10 years, your 40 acres will outperform their 400. Walt didn't tell anyone about that conversation. He went home and kept working. In 1984, year 4, Walt planted his first crop on dead ground. Not the whole 40, just the flattest 25 acres, the ground that had recovered the most. He planted oats and red clover together, a traditional combination where the oats give a grain harvest while the clover establishes underneath. The oats yielded 62 bushels per acre. Not spectacular, not what the good ground next door produced, but completely respectable for ground that had been called dead 3 years earlier. His operating cost for those 25 acres was roughly $400, diesel for the farmall, seed, no fertilizer purchased, no herbicides, no expensive inputs. The clover was providing the nitrogen, the biology was controlling the weeds. Net profit from dead ground in 1984, a little under $4,000. Phil Kramer, driving past on the county road, told people at the cafe that Gunderson's fields looked thin and weedy and like he was wasting his time. Phil was looking at the crop. Walt was looking at the soil. By 1985, the soil told a different story. The organic matter on the flat ground had risen to 2.4%, double what it had been in 1981. The earthworm count Walt measured in a 1-foot square hole dug 12 inches deep had gone from 2 per sample to 14. The soil was darker, visibly, noticeably darker. The limestone fragments were still there, but they were surrounded now by living, breathing material that held moisture instead of shedding it. That same year, Phil Kramer closed his dealership. The building sat empty on the highway outside Jessup. The big green John Deere sign went dark for the first time in 23 years. Phil took a job selling insurance in Waterloo. Walt planted his first corn on dead ground in 1985. Not the whole 40, just 8 acres, the best recovered flat ground. He planted it no-till with a planter he'd modified himself in the workshop, adding coulters to cut through the clover residue. No fertilizer, no herbicides. He planted directly into the killed clover sod and trusted 5 years of biological work to provide what the crop needed. The corn came up uneven. The no-till planter wasn't perfect. The stand was thinner than a conventional field. Phil Kramer, no longer a dealer but still driving past, told people at the cafe that Gunderson's corn looked like hell, told you that ground was dead. But Phil was looking at the rows. Walt was looking at the roots. When the August heat arrived, the kind that bakes Iowa clay into concrete and stresses conventional corn into rolling its leaves by noon, as the plant tries to conserve moisture, Walt's corn didn't roll. The soil under the clover residue was cool and moist. The mycorrhizal fungi that had rebuilt themselves over 5 years of biological recovery were delivering water and phosphorus from depths that conventional root systems couldn't reach. The soil functioned like a sponge, absorbing rainfall and releasing it slowly, the way a healthy soil is supposed to. Walt's 8 acres of first-year corn on dead ground yielded 134 bushels per acre. The county average that year, on ground that was supposed to be some of the best soil in Iowa, was 128. Dale Meser called Iowa State. "You need to send someone out here," he said. "Something is happening on Gunderson's 40 that you need to see." By 1988, Walt had been working dead ground for 7 years. The transformation was visible from the county road. Where there had been weeds and cedar trees and exposed limestone, there was now a patchwork of dark soil, thick grass, and healthy crops. The fence rows were clean. The cattle were fat on grass that hadn't existed 7 years earlier. The creek along the south edge, which had run muddy and silted for decades, ran clear because the slopes above it were no longer losing soil. Iowa State sent a graduate student named Corinne Price to study the 40 that summer. She spent the season collecting data, and what she found became part of her master's thesis. The organic matter had risen from 1.2% in 1981 to 3.8% in 1988. The water infiltration rate, how fast rainfall soaks into soil instead of running off, had increased by 340%. The earthworm population was 22 per cubic foot, higher than the county average on Class 1 ground. Her thesis, titled Biological Restoration of Degraded Cropland in Northeast Iowa, a 7-year case study, was cited in 12 subsequent papers on soil health and regenerative agriculture. Walt never read it. He was too busy farming. That year he planted 30 of the 40 acres to corn and yielded 148 bushels per acre. The county average was 131. His cost per bushel was around 85 cents. The county average cost per bushel was around $2. The 40 acres Walt had bought for $7,400 in 1981, that everyone had called worthless, that nobody else would touch, was appraising in 1988 at $1,400 an acre. His investment had returned 657% in 7 years, with no loan, no interest payments, no risk of foreclosure. While his neighbors had been leveraged to the teeth on $3,200 ground that was now worth $1,200 ground that was dragging them under, Walt had bought the cheapest dirt in the county and built it into the most productive. The reckoning came on a Saturday morning in October at the Jessup sale barn. Walt was there selling calves, standing at the fence watching the auctioneer work, when a man walked up beside him. It was Phil Kramer, former John Deere dealer, now selling insurance, cheaper suit than he used to wear, driving a car with someone else's name on the side. Phil watched the cattle go through the ring for a while without saying anything. "Walt," he finally said, "I drove past your 40 the other day. Looks different." "Yes, it does." "How'd the corn do?" 148. Phil was quiet for a long time, long enough for 2 more lots of calves to go through. "I sold 200 tractors in this county," Phil said. "Big ones, expensive ones. Told every farmer he needed more horsepower, more acres, more iron. Most of them are gone now, lost their farms, lost everything." He paused. "You bought the worst 40 acres in the county with cash, planted clover on it, and you're still here." He looked at Walt. "I think maybe you were the only one who knew what he was doing." Walt kept his eyes on the ring. "The ground was never the problem, Phil," he said. "The debt was." Walter Gunderson farmed dead ground for 27 more years. By the time he retired in 2015, those 40 acres had organic matter levels above 5%, equal to virgin prairie soil that had never been touched by a plow. He never took out a loan. He never bought a new tractor. When the Farmall M finally gave out in 1994 at 16,000 hours, he replaced it with a used Farmall 560 he bought at auction for $800 cash. He didn't get rich. That was never the point. He got something better. He got to stay. While 300,000 American farms disappeared in the 1980s, Walt's 40 acres got a little darker and a little deeper and a little more alive every year. He proved something the soil scientists and the extension agents and the bankers and the dealers had all forgotten. The land doesn't need money thrown at it. It needs time. It needs patience. It needs biology. And it needs someone who understands the difference between ground that's dead and ground that's just tired. Dale Mezer retired from the Extension Service in 1998. On his last day, he went into his office and took down the soil map that had hung on the wall for 30 years. He looked at the white patch in the northwest corner, the 40 acres he'd named dead ground and never thought twice about. He picked up a black marker and colored it in, as dark as the best ground in the county. Then he wrote 2 words underneath it. Walt's ground.